Welcome back to the Urban Monk, here in studio with Dr. Laura Schmidt, who is visiting via Skype from UC San Francisco. She's at the School of Medicine, and man, they've been doing some cool work out there. Going after soda and what soda means to us as a public health disaster, and just going after not just the healthy stuff that we know, but going after the policy and being able to transform how we legislate around this so that we don't put people at risk. And so lots of cool stuff to talk about. Doc, welcome to the show.
Yeah, good to be here.
And thanks for doing the work that you do. This is important.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is important stuff. And so let's start from the top. I mean, most people already know soda's probably not the best thing for you. Let's get into a little bit of the kind of the public health issue with the sugar in soda and why, what's driven you to do this work in the first place.
Yeah, a lot of people ask the question, why sugar? Why now? Why is it the new tobacco? These sorts of why do we care so much all of a sudden? And the truth is that a lot of this is spurred by new science, science that's evolved in the last 5 to 10 years. And in particular, there are two public health consequences of heavy sugar consumption that were either underappreciated or even unknown up until fairly recently. The first has to do with the appearance of adult onset diabetes in children. So in our parents' generation, they called it adult onset diabetes because only adults got it. And suddenly we've started seeing an epidemic of diabetes. This is not type 1 diabetes that you're born with. This is type 2 that you acquire through unhealthy diet, obesity, other related causes, and sugar being one of them. We're seeing marked rise in childhood diabetes. To the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention predict that of children alive today, 1 in 4 will be diabetic at some point in their lifetimes, and of those children of color, 1 in 2 will be diabetic. And so what we're looking at is a public health crisis. Diabetes is not a condition that goes away. It gets worse if it's not recognized early on and treated with insulin injections and other forms of, you can't make it go away, but you can contain it, prevent it from damaging your body further. But if it's left untreated, it leads to blindness, limb amputations, kidney disease. It's a big problem for the individual as well as the society when you're talking about maintaining a quarter of our population on diabetes, dealing with the consequences and the complications of type 2 diabetes as these people age over time. So we're really looking at down the barrel of a gun on that one. Then the other fairly recent, even more recent observation in the scientific community has to do with a condition that didn't even have a name 30 years ago. It's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We think it's affecting about 1/3 of the adult population and about maybe a smaller proportion of children, maybe around 11 to 13%. The only known risk factors for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or as we say NAFLD, is our trans fat consumption, heavy sugar consumption, and obesity. Soon, in about 5 years, we're looking at NAFLD will be the #1 cause of liver transplantation in America. So this condition that we didn't even have a name for before our obesity epidemic, before we started consuming excess sugar, took the fat out of our diet, put the sugar in, this condition will be the leading cause of liver transplantation. The liver surgeons here at UCSF that I've spoken to are really, really concerned about this. There are a lot of issues. Most of these people are diabetic as well as having fatty liver disease. Once they get a transplant, assuming we have enough livers to go around, there are often problems with their diabetes treatments not doing so well with the anti-organ rejection drugs. It's really a mess. And so this is a condition that we've only recently come to appreciate, and this is true. We've now got very solid evidence from animal studies, studies of rats, studies of humans in clinical trials and so forth, population-based evidence to demonstrate that fructose consumption, a particular kind of sugar, is definitely linked to the rise in this condition. And this, of course, is a major concern in the medical community.
So it's obviously a no-brainer. We're taking this thing, a species is poisoning itself with fructose and causing two things that down the barrel. I mean, I've looked at studies that say like 70% of ER visits are oftentimes sequelae of diabetes and things that kind of come downstream from having all these out of control kind of internal chronic health issues. And so we now recognize that it's dumb to be doing this. Right, it's just dumb as a species. It's what, why would you poison yourself? Yet we continue to do so. So fructose is the kind of the enemy in this lineup. Is that what I'm hearing? Is it just
well, they're different. It's complicated because there are different types of sugars, and depending on the type of sugar, your body will metabolize it differently. The concern with fructose is that it's almost exclusively metabolized by the liver. Mm-hmm. Our livers are pretty much everything that goes in and out of our bodies gets somehow processed by the liver, goes through the liver. It's a really vital organ, and when you start clogging it up with fat, with this fatty liver disease, it becomes more and more dysfunctional, and that leads to a cascade of problems hormonally. It changes the insulin response. We think it has, the liver's a pretty fundamental organ in your body. You don't want to be messing with it. And then other kinds of sugars come in and affect the pancreas, which is the organ in our body that regulates blood sugar. And that's when you start developing type 2 diabetes, or insulin resistance, the organ responsible for regulating the sugar in your blood, for getting the cells to take up the sugars and use them for energy or store them as fat. Becomes unable to regulate your blood sugar. You get out of control blood sugar levels, and people wind up in the ER, as you're pointing out.
Sure. So, okay, so we have the traditional sugars, sucrose, fructose, all these things. So we have issues with the pancreas and the ability to kind of move sugar and do things. Separately, we have this new fatty liver thing that we're figuring out. I'd love for you to tease this out a little bit more, because people are now, if I'm hearing fat in the liver, I'm not getting the sugar connection. So a lot of people don't see the fructose creating the kind of fat deposits in the liver. So I'd love for you to tease that out a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So the perfect analogy is alcoholic fatty liver disease, namely cirrhosis of the liver, which is something that we've known about for hundreds of years. If people drink too much alcohol, their liver will become damaged. The liver becomes inflamed, it gets scarred, it becomes, and that has to do with the deposition of fats in the liver. And eventually it fails. They become cirrhotic and they need a liver transplant. It turns out that fructose is through the very same metabolic mechanism. Fructose is taken up by the liver in the identical manner. So people often will talk about people who drink too much get a beer belly. Well, there's also a sugar belly, and there's a reason for that. The exact same mechanism in your liver that transforms ethanol or alcohol metabolizes fructose. So through this process, de novo lipogenesis, the liver is basically looking at, say you're sitting on your couch, or couch potato, you're watching the game, and you down a giant 48-ounce Gatorade or sugary beverage you're not moving around, you're not going to mobilize that sugar, the fructose, for energy. You're just sitting there and maybe it's even taken on an empty stomach. So essentially what happens is that fructose is going to slam your liver with this heavy dose and your liver's going to say, oh, okay, I better deal with this. Mm-hmm. I got to metabolize it. Because you're not using it as energy and mobilizing it and burning it off, your liver will transform it into fat. transform the sugar, the fructose, into fat through this process of de novo lipogenesis. What happens is some of those fats get laid down in the liver itself, and some get sent out into the bloodstream, and which will raise what we call triglycerides in the bloodstream. So one way you know if you have this problem with fructose, fatty liver disease, potentially metabolic syndrome, we call it, is because when you go to your doctor and you get a blood test, they'll say, hey, you got high triglycerides in your blood. That's a sign that you've got a problem. Another way you can know is if you tend to have a lot of fat around the waist. That selective deposition, those fats that go out into the bloodstream, get selectively deposited around the waist, which is why you get that sugar belly. As it is now, we don't have the greatest ways of figuring out, without doing lab testing on an individual, whether they have metabolic syndrome, which is really the precursor for most forms of chronic disease, not just heart disease, diabetes, but interestingly, Alzheimer's disease. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing this tremendous uptick in Alzheimer's disease, and probably poor nutrition is a cause of this. But the short of going into your doctor and getting a blood test to see if you have if you've got problems with hormonal insulin resistance, high triglycerides, uncontrolled blood sugar, the best way to know if you might be at risk for this NAFLD and other related conditions is if you have a lot of visceral fat. It's really the only way an individual knows. If you do, it's time to get into the doctor and get assessed for metabolic syndrome. One of the big pushes right now, we know diabetes is a silent disease at first. People don't know they've got it. And so one of the big pushes in medicine right now is to get people who are pre-diabetic, who are not yet suffering from the permanent irreversible condition, get people screened. And if they're pre-diabetic, they have insulin resistance, there are things that can be done to prevent them from getting the permanent condition. And so that's a big push right now. And that's why we tell people, if you got a lot of fat around your gut, and if you're obese, if your waist is bigger than your hips, those are very important visible signs that you might have a problem that you need to deal with right away. Sure. Don't let it wait. The worst thing in the world is to go blind, to have your limbs amputated. This is very, for the physicians that I work with who are on the front lines, this is really, really tragic to see this happening, especially in children.
So you are, somewhere maybe 20 feet behind the front lines, looking at the MASH unit of people coming in on this. And it's a completely preventable, we shouldn't even be taking these bullets.
Exactly.
And so let's talk about why sugar consumption, it's such a no-brainer that we got to change this, but then we have these sodas in the schools. We have this sugar industry pushing this stuff and keeping their products going for commercial reasons. And you guys are trying to stop this, obviously. There's a lot of people out there that have been talking about this. You've had some success. I want to talk about what you've done over at UCSF and talk about how we can set this as a precedent for future successes and really kind of just get out ahead of this thing. This thing's ridiculous, and so there's no reason we should be waging this war. We got bigger fish to fry, but here we are.
Well, the big concern is that we've allowed our food system to just get out of whack. We have become a population that eats primarily through convenience. We eat processed and packaged foods. These are foods that are designed to have a very long shelf life. Sugar is a great way to increase the shelf life of products, as well as salt. These are sometimes some people call them Frankenstein foods. They are often scientifically engineered in labs by food scientists to get our hedonic system, our reward system, into hyperdrive in the brain. There's literally, I come from an addiction research background, and food scientists and corporations are taking people and using the very technologies that we developed to cure addictions namely functional MRI testing of the limbic region of the brain, the reward center. They're using it to figure out how to make a Dorito chip taste better. And so we're actually at this point, it's very, very difficult for individuals to turn back the clock and eat like our grandparents did. Michael Pollan says, don't eat, eat like your grandmother. Well, good luck. You got 2 kids and a 2-income family, and your grocery store, 84% of the foods in your grocery store have added sugar. Your kids go to school and eat junk. They're used to this. Our palates change so that only hyper sweet stuff even tastes good. Good luck. That puts the individual at a burden on the individual to try to figure out a way to carefully navigate this crazy food environment to find an apple, to find a drinking fountain. And I have a colleague, Anisha Patel, who does work in schools with water. And in California, we're required to have at least one drinking fountain in the school, in the cafeteria. And half the time she goes in and it's like, there's a bunch of junk and storage stuff in front of it. Like the kids literally don't have access to water.
Wow.
And so our food environment has just become completely distorted and out of whack. It's no individual's fault. We have a real problem actually with the population and many people blaming the individual for something that is an environmental problem. And I mean, if we were all breathing in asbestos and developing lung disease, we'd all say, well, that's not your fault. You need to breathe. But at the same time, we're all eating crap and it's all that's around us. We got to eat, and yet we blame the individual. And so it really is, at this point, it's beyond, unless you are very wealthy, you have somebody to cook for you, you have a lot of money to spend on very high-priced fruits and vegetables, and you have a tremendous amount of willpower, and you don't work in a typical workplace where the food environment's saturated with junk, maybe you have a chance. But for most of the population, that's just not a reasonable solution. And so we have to look to environmental solutions to the problem. You asked about what UCSF decided to do last year. On the 1st of November, the leadership of the university said, we're a health sciences university. We run one of the top elite medical centers in the country. We're the 2nd largest employer in San Francisco. What are we doing in the business of selling these products, these sugary beverages that we know cause the very diseases that clog up our hospitals? We're supposed to be about health. Why should we make a profit off this stuff?
Good for you.
And they made the bold decision to just stop selling the stuff. They didn't want it to be moralistic or nanny state or pushing anybody to do what other people wanted them to do. They just said, we're getting out of the business of selling it. And if we take a hit on financially, and literally the chief medical officer of our medical center, when the idea was proposed, said, look, we don't put cigarettes in our vending machines. Why should we put this stuff in our vending machines?
Right.
Like, that's the spirit of it. And since then, we've conducted a careful evaluation, including doing full physicals and blood testing of a representative sample of our employees to see what the effects of just this one small change. The university, both the medical center and the campus, just stop selling this stuff. We're not saying you can't bring it in a 6-pack and put it in the office fridge. We're not saying you can't go out and buy it somewhere else. We're just saying we're out of the business. And remarkably, we've learned many things a year later. We've seen a very substantial decline in consumption, especially among our manual and service workers. These are, the people who are the janitors in the hospitals, and they're typically low-income individuals who, work in the cafeterias. At the beginning, before we passed the we're consuming almost a liter a day of soda. By 6 months later, their consumption was down by 25%, 1/4 decline. We're seeing tremendous benefits in our biomarker study in terms of actual health. And this is just one small change in the food environment, making it it's a gentle nudge, just making it a little harder to grab for that soda and making it a little easier. We have lots of over 100 different bottled beverages in our refrigerators all around, in our cafeterias, in our vending machines. We have millions of food courts and Panda Express and Subway and Jamba Juice, and they all voluntarily participated all of our vendors did, in making this move. And it's supporting the whole, not only our employees, but also patients, the families. When you go to the hospital and you have a family member in the hospital, you're basically captive, right? You've had a family member in the hospital, you have nowhere to go. And if the food environment in that hospital is junk, if your kid is in for being treated for diabetic coma, and you're in the hospital with that kid for several days, and the only thing you can get is junk food, that's a real problem.
Yep.
And so what's been very encouraging is to see the tremendous interest in the health sector. We've been called by hospitals, universities, literally Australia, Poland, people in Poland calling us to say, how did you do that? Did it work? Did it make a difference? And so that we're hoping that this will be something that the health sector really can show some leadership in. It's really a private sector solution, because if employers and health and hospitals and if a large sector of our economy can say, look, this is a simple change we can make, we're hoping that it will spread spontaneously without anybody having to
get draconian.
Yeah, no government interference. This is a private choice that employers, and one of the big questions on everyone's mind now is, what would be the long-term healthcare savings? Think of, if you're an employer, you have a large population of people you're paying for insurance, their health insurance. Even within a few years, if they reverse their metabolic disease, you're going to see massive savings in healthcare costs. They don't have to go in maybe for as many people for insulin injections anymore. Yeah. They're not going to develop chronic illnesses. And the other exciting thing that we found was that our sales of beverages were basically flat during the first year. And this is most likely because there were so many healthy alternatives that we could put in refrigerators in our retail stores and in our cafeterias. We did a very careful search, over 100 different unsweetened teas, flavored waters, all sorts of things that people can drink that are refreshing and delicious and don't harm their health.
And so bottom line didn't really get impacted, and your conscious decision to do this actually is transforming the health of the entire campus. I mean, so we're doing this whole series on conscious capitalism right now, and so this is a market-driven decision that really shifted things, and I want to see these ripples into all the industries, right? Like, I think it was CVS. I don't want to give them credit if they didn't get it, but one of them said, why are we're a drugstore, why are we selling cigarettes? Same thing.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think for our campus and our medical center, it was really almost, dare I say, a moral decision or an ethical decision.
Yep.
If we're exclusively a health sciences university, we have the top school of dentistry here. Why
pushing
would we
sugar
possibly be encouraging people to bathe their teeth in sugar that rots their teeth? Why would we possibly want to be doing that? So for us, it was very much a decision about who we are and what we stand for. but even any private sector entity, any employer cares about the people in their organization. And I think the same argument can be made, especially given that we didn't lose money. We worried. I mean, I know our chief financial officer was very worried that we were going to lose money on beverage sales. But the reality is everybody's going to drink something. When you go in to buy your sandwich at lunch, you're going to buy a drink. And so and this has been borne out in the studies of where they've taxed soda in Berkeley and in Mexico. Sugary beverage sales go down, bottled water consumption goes up. It's as simple as that, because people are going to drink something. It's habitual. You're used to it. And I've talked to many crowds around UCSF, given guest lectures and grand rounds and so forth. And I'll ask how many people noticed that we stopped selling sugary beverages. And a substantial number of people will not raise their hands because it's subtle enough. It's not like you go into the restaurants on campus and there's nothing to buy.
Right.
And so this is, I think, a misnomer that if we aren't selling sugar and sugar water, people won't drink anything.
Right.
That just has not been borne out in the research
or
in our experience.
Well, which is even better than that, right? Because research can miss predictions. Your experience is
Yes.
gold, right? So there's a couple things here, and this is okay. So a cynical person would say, effectively, this would be bad for your hospital business because within 5 to 10 years, there's less diabetic complications coming in for the medical business, right? So
that's a pretty cynical person,
right? But that is a full circle thing.
That we're not transplanting more livers,
right? Right. So the business of medicine is what it is, but I don't think anyone wants to be transplanting livers. We want to be talking about epigenetics. We want to be talking about kind of curing other things. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
We're all sitting here.
Why would we want? These are preventable diseases, not even hard to prevent.
Yeah.
In our current food environment, maybe they are hard to prevent. I think that's the piece of the story that I think kind of gets obscured in the public discourse. People very quickly jump to this idea it's all about nanny state and government has to tinker in people's individual choices. But when you really back up and look at the situation, you start noticing that somebody is tinkering in our choices, and it's not government. It's food companies that want to sell us hyper-palatable foods that are habit-forming. They're competing for shelf space. They're competing to make it eye level. They're competing to market it and push it on our kids. And they're not pushing broccoli, right? They're not aggressively trying to get our kids hooked on apples.
They're not addictive.
That's important to notice. Yeah. That is constraining our choices. Yeah. That's what I call limited choices. When 84% of the stuff in your grocery store is sugar added to it, you have a very small, limited set of choices in terms of what you're going to buy. And I don't think personally, why should I, as a consumer, have to shop around the perimeter, go out of my way to buy something that's healthy and delicious? Why should I have to do that? Right. Let the companies, go to the extra trouble. And so this whole discussion around choice to me is kind of upside down and backwards. I'm not so sure we've got choice. I think my grandmother had better choices over what she ate than I do.
Well, I mean, the odds are stacked against. I mean, they have gajillions of dollars in neuroscience and colors and smells and textures and all sorts of really insidious things that are really stacked against us. I'd like to actually speak to that. We just talked, before we got on camera here, we were speaking about this little thing that happened in the industry and how there was some kind of bot science that came out against. So I'd love for you to share that because this is important to understand that this is what happens.
Well, we have some of the researchers here at UCSF are conducting what we call industry documents research, and UCSF has been the home to the worldwide resource, which is a digital library of documents from tobacco corporations. They're required to, on a regular basis, to give their internal documents to the UCSF library where they're archived, digitized, and put online so that any member of the public, any journalist, any academic, anybody interested in what's going on behind the veil of the tobacco industry can look inside and see in their own words what they're up to. And this was part of a master settlement agreement where the tobacco companies got sued and basically agreed to do this as part of the conditions of the settlement. It turns out that there are other sources out there for documents like this, and we've started to look into food industry documents, food company documents, and try to understand in a similar way, how is it that food companies operate to manipulate our choices, to do they intentionally try to get us hooked on hyperpalatable foods and so forth? And some of the materials we have are historical and have been very enlightening. We have a pretty sizable cache of documents on the main trade organization for the beet and cane sugar producers, currently called the Sugar Association. And these documents go way back into the 50s. And so we can really understand how the trade organizations for the sugar industry have been, what their agenda has been, what they've been up to, and a big revelation from this line of research is that they've done historically and currently as well a considerable amount of meddling in the scientific enterprise and even in the funding of federally funded research in the medical field. So the first paper that we published in this area demonstrated that in the 1970s, the Sugar Association wrote 78% of the strategic plan for the NIH around dental disease. And this was a strategic plan that steered the course of dental disease for a decade and a half. It very carefully was set up to avoid any mention or any research on dietary sugars. It had scientists in labs trying to find a vaccine to prevent cavities, as opposed to just a simple thing, right? Don't bathe your teeth in sugar. Like every mom knows that. But no, we needed a vaccine, right? And so that was the first piece that came out from this archive. A more recent one that just got published towards the end of last year shows that in the mid-60s, the Sugar Association approached a team of elite scientists at Harvard University in the nutrition field and paid them $50,000 to publish a review paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the most prestigious U.S. medical journal. And the review systematically assessed the evidence that was asked the question, what causes cardiovascular disease, heart disease? And the review concluded that the dietary villain was cholesterol and saturated fats, and we need not worry about sugar. Now, this paper came out in the New England Journal in the mid-60s. Right about 1970, we started to see the anti-fat craze, where the Snackwell generation, where we were all eating margarine, not butter, and we were eating cookies that had no fat but were loaded with sugar. And boom, we've got this massive obesity epidemic. Really, the beginning of the obesity epidemic was the early 70s. And so this line of research really raises some very profound questions about how industry and its trade organizations can and do meddle in science, meddle in federal agencies that are supposed to be neutral and focused on health and health promotion. There was a recent scandal at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention where it was determined that key senior people in the CDC were funded by Coca-Cola and the beverage industries, and were giving them all sorts of information and trying to steer policy. People got fired a week later, or got quit a week later.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're starting to see the ways in which industry has deeply penetrated the scientific community, scientific enterprise, in order to distort the facts around what's good for our health. And this is a issue of tremendous concern. Industry will come back and say, and we had quite a bit of discussion in the media, in the news media and the TV news and so forth, with spokespeople for the Sugar Association when this paper of ours came out. And they say, well, today we're all just fine. Scientists are required to report their scientific conflicts of interest when they publish papers in scientific journals. Ironically, the Harvard scientists who wrote that review in the 60s in the New England Journal of Medicine were paid by the Sugar Association to do so, did declare scientific conflicts of interest. They declared all of their funders except one, the Sugar Association. They neglected to point out that they had been funded by the Sugar Association. So many of us are not convinced that that what the public is hearing around nutrition advice is neutral scientific information. A lot of it's tainted.
Yeah, well, listen, I think prostitution is older than medicine as a profession. And so, this is what we're dealing with. This is what we fight is, so let's get clear about this. You're at UCSF. You've looked at all the literature. Your colleagues, there's a huge board of people here. I'm looking at all these doctors and dentists and people that are part of this sugar science understanding. Is sugar bad for our health? Right? I mean, come on. That's it.
Why UCSF decided to sponsor the Sugar Science Initiative. There was just a need to get scientists together who don't have scientific conflicts of interest, who have never taken money from from vested interests. A scientific conflict of interest is when somebody who paid me has a financial stake in the outcomes of my research, in what I conclude in my research. And so UCSF organized about a dozen scientists who have no conflicts of interest to review the body of literature around specific disease outcomes and sugar consumption, and to report in a pretty user-friendly way what is our conclusion. Is there a link between sugar consumption and diabetes? Yes or no? Industry denies it. The Dietary Guidelines Committee that is organized by the U.S. government, they say there is a connection. Who am I to believe? And so sugar science is a resource, a public education resource sponsored by UCSF, sugarscience.org, where people can go and get information that's been looked at for conflicts of interest, as well as the robustness of the evidence. Do we have a substantial amount of evidence to say, yes, sugary beverage consumption leads to obesity? Remarkably, the beverage industry continues to deny that sugary beverages cause weight gain or obesity.
Yeah.
And they fund scientists to draw this conclusion as well and try to get it published in the peer-reviewed literature. So there's a need for somebody to kind of cut through all of that discussion and say, look, we're independent scientists and we looked at the literature and here's what we think.
Yeah, I mean, look, we might be looking at an era where shortly you can only buy these sugary beverages at liquor stores and, there's parts of restaurants where you can go drink this stuff. I don't know, but I mean, it's look, people can decide for themselves, and I understand the whole, this whole thing about, big government. I get it. but the odds are stacked against us. These are addictive substances, and it's just they're not playing fair. And children in particular are being exposed to things that it's really hard to undo. Especially if they've already gotten to diabetes. So I know we get a couple questions from our audience, and I want to make sure that we honor that. So I'm going to kick over to Sean over here.
Yeah. Sean Cam. Hi. MK said that she hears the liver is one of the most resilient organs in our body. So does mineral consumption and absorption aid in the liver recovery alongside getting rid of fructose and stopping to drink?
Mineral absorption and consumption. Yeah. Did you hear all that?
Okay. So
yep.
I did. I think the question is about if I stop drinking sugary beverages and I cut back on my sugar consumption, keep it within 10% of daily calories, which is the current limit. It's not like the committees that set dietary guidelines are saying don't have any added sugar. It's just keep it within a limit. For women, we say 6 teaspoons a day or less. For men, 9 teaspoons a day or less, which is, when you think about it, that's a lot of sugar. If you were to add it to a glass of water, 6 teaspoons would make it taste pretty darn sweet.
Yeah.
You could essentially you use up your bank account of sugar as a man by just drinking 1 soda. So that gives you a feeling for how much sugar is in there. But one of the remarkable things, in answer to the viewer's question about the liver, is that it heals. It can, as long as you're not into full-blown what we call NASH or cirrhosis, where there's tremendous scarring. The liver has a remarkable capacity to regenerate, unlike some organs in our bodies. And so liver damage, as long as it's not too far along, is reversible. For a person who has had a liver scan and knows they have NAFLD, the most important thing would be to reduce or cut out all trans fats and added sugars. That's going to give your liver a breather and a chance to regenerate. And in fact, one of the cutting edge surgeries that we do here at UCSF is what they call a partial liver transplant, where a surgeon will take a healthy donor's portion of their liver and put it into a person with a failed liver. And the liver just regenerates very quickly.
In both people.
And so, in both people,
yeah.
the donor literally very quickly. Yeah. And so it's a remarkable organ that way. It's probably not so true for the pancreas, and for people who have developed insulin resistance. But for the liver aspect of what sugar does to our bodies, we're really lucky to be able to reverse that damage. Yeah. Anyone who's overweight or obese, anyone who eats a poor diet, eats a lot of processed junk food, is very much at risk for, some degree of fatty liver, and should be just like someone who's drinking too much. More than 1 drink a day for women, more than 2 for men. You're putting your liver at risk, and so reducing that is a really smart idea.
And taking minerals or anything else for regenerative support. I mean, I'm not sure.
That, to my mind, I'm not a nutritionist, and I wouldn't want to speak to that. I know the liver stores vitamin D. You'd need to speak to a nutritionist about what about minerals
on the front end. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. You got another question?
So besides sugary drinks, after that, what's the next thing that we should get rid of?
Okay, so assuming we've gotten rid of sugary drinks, where's the next rung? Like, what's the next thing to get rid of that's causing some of these problems?
For an individual.
For an individual, yeah. Okay. So I quit soda, and now how can I even do better?
Oh, if you've quit soda, you have done a remarkable favor to your body. Sugary beverages are about 36% of the total added sugar consumed in the American diet.
Wow.
So that's why the public health community is so focused around this. One of the reasons why the public health community is advising the public to cut down on those sugary drinks. So you have done yourself an enormous favor. Diet drinks have a somewhat questionable scientific track record. There's some evidence that diet drinks, saccharin, sucralose, these artificial sweeteners actually are not the best long-term substitute for added sugars. That they actually, ironically, produce weight gain and a condition called glucose intolerance, which is very closely related to insulin resistance, namely diabetes. And the mechanism scientists think is associated with these, and I know this is bad news because a lot of people who have worked so hard to get off the sugar, they use the diet drinks as a substitute. And while that's a great thing to do on a short-term basis because your palate has just been sensitized to hyper sweet stuff, and you can titrate off of the sugar that way, probably best to let go of the diet drinks if you can, or at least not drink them in heavy doses because of this evidence. This isn't there's still controversy in the field around this, but there's some pretty compelling studies of animals as well as humans that suggest that the artificial sweeteners are damaging, lead to weight gain and glucose intolerance. The mechanism is the what we call the microbiome, the healthy gut bacteria that it's essential to good health, immunity, and it turns out that what the scientists think is true is that these artificial sweeteners actually damage those healthy bacteria, and that microbiome is supportive of our health in very, very profound, impactful ways. And so our diet is very directly associated with the health of the microbiome. So if you can, what we recommend is to titrate yourself off. A good strategy, whether it's a sugary drink or a diet drink, is to just start mixing half and half fizzy water with the drink. Get yourself used to a lower dose and get to the point where you're adding fresh fruit and lemon rather the sweet stuff or the artificially sweetened stuff. And I swear to you, if you do that, you will take one little sip of a soda and you'll go, ah!
Yeah.
Or you'll drink a diet, go, gosh, that tastes terrible.
Yeah.
You will not believe what a difference it makes. Our palates in America have just become sensitized to the sweet factor. And if you cut this stuff out of your diet, and your kids' diet, it's remarkable. When you realize how sweet many of these foods and beverages are.
Yeah, and to know how far off we've gone. I got one follow-up question. We're almost out of time, but it's an important one because I've also heard a lot of people kind of lean into this too much and say, oh, you said fructose is bad for fatty liver, therefore don't eat any fruit, right? And I've seen people take this kind of step and go into some of these kind of excessive conversations. So I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Thanks for bringing that up because it's always hard, and especially with nutrition, when you're trying to communicate to the public, it's really easy for the message to get distorted or lost. Yeah. And we're talking about pretty subtle aspects of diet and nutrition and what we know scientifically. The evidence on fruit is overwhelmingly positive. Fresh fruit, whole fruit, not even in a smoothie, whole fruit, chewed, is the way to eat it. And the reason is because it's going to take you a long time to chew through the number of apples that will wind up in an apple juice or in a smoothie. And the sugars and the fructose remains often the hypothesis that David Ludwig has put forward. He's at Harvard, a nutrition scientist, is that it may even be that some of that fructose stays inside the membrane of the plant cell and passes through our system through the small intestine and doesn't even get absorbed. And so when that fructose comes in fiber, with a lot of fiber, In the plant membrane, chewed in our mouths, it slowly goes through our system, and it comes packaged with phytonutrients, nutrients that we don't even have names for. I mean, we don't even know how many nutrients there are that make plants colorful and tasty and flavorful and smell beautiful. Those are all healthy things nutrients for our, that can serve to fight metabolic disease. And so, if you look at the cohort studies and long-term trials, people who eat fruit tend to have lower risk for cardiovascular disease later in life, and controlling on other factors. So there's very good evidence that fruit is heart healthy, and probably a lot of it has to do with the fiber and the micronutrients that come contained in the fruit. And the fructose just is that fiber is going to slow down the processing, the speed at which your body's going to metabolize the fructose. And so it's not like slamming your liver with a 28-ounce Gatorade.
Right.
It's slowly. And they're a wonderful source of these other nutrients as well.
But I'm only going to drink organic Gatorade, so I'm fine. Doc,
laugh. There's an organic Gatorade now.
Of course there is.
This is
And this is
related.
sugar. Yeah. Gluten-free cookies and organic Gatorade. Problem solved, right? It's just this waving of the wand and just kind of it's just words.
I call it organic junk. And it's a new market, right? Because
big one.
There's a opposite and equal reaction. And so our population, because of getting the word out there, all these public health officials and dietary committees saying, people, stop drinking the sugary drinks. They're not good for you. We've seen a 25% decline in soda consumption since its peak in the late 90s. And so what are these companies going to do? They're going to make organic Gatorade. They're going to turn it into a marketing opportunity. We have to be smarter than that. Yeah. And we have to realize that just because it says organic or healthy on the label, they can put whatever they want on the front of that package. We don't have laws that require them. I mean, there have been some lawsuits around some of these extreme claims, but the front of package labeling is poorly regulated. And so don't believe what's on the front of the package. Turn it around and look at the label. And if you're a woman and it's got, 28 grams of sugar in it, that's your total daily dose. Yeah. And so think about 25 grams, 38 for a man. And so it's very important to turn that package around. And just because it says organic doesn't mean anything.
Amen. Doc, thank you so much. The website is called sugarscience.org. I love the work that you're doing. I encourage anyone who's in a university, school, any organization to kind of follow this step that UCSF has taken. And look, the market will drive the change. And at the end of the day, no one's got a gun to your head saying buy this bottle of Coca-Cola. Exactly. So as a consumer, you gotta make decisions too. And so the ecosystem at UCSF makes it way more conducive to do so. And so we can work together with businesses to do it. I want to thank you for being on the show. Any other questions, we'll get in the chat thread and we'll forward them over to you. Thank you for being here. Let me know what you think. I'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you.